Hello and welcome to our Menstrual Equity 101 workshop. Thank you all so much for sharing your time with us today. And we are super excited to be presenting this workshop to all of you. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started today. There will be some interactive portions of the workshop. So we do recommend having a pen and paper handy. So with that, we will start our slow kind of introduction to acknowledge the privilege that we have from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands we currently reside on. We would love for everyone to think for a minute about what the lands that you are on means to you. And we encourage you all to check out the website native-land.ca, which allows you to enter your address or city and learn more about the land you are situated on and its history. And we hope this gives you a greater understanding of the challenges Indigenous peoples experience as a result of genocide and colonialism, and an opportunity to reflect on what this land means to you as an individual, as well as thinking about colonial oppressions that are happening all over the world. With that, we will introduce ourselves. So my name is Priya. I use pronouns she, they. I am a genderqueer menstrual equity educator. And I am a program facilitator and francophone consultant at Free Periods Canada. Today, I'm located on the traditional homelands of the Mohawk and Haudenosaunee people, which is colonially known as Montreal, where we have some sun that will be setting as the workshop goes on. So I might have to disappear for a sec and turn my light on. Um, and I will let Kuisan introduce herself.
Thanks, Priya. Hey everyone, my name's Kweesun and my pronouns are she, her. I'm joining you today from the traditional homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, colonially known as East Vancouver. I'm a program coordinator with Free Periods Canada, and I also work as a researcher in the field of sexual health education and sexualized violence prevention.
Thank you so much, Kuisan. As we continue to kind of really get into it, slowly warming up to the topic of menstrual equity, we have some learning outcomes for today. The menstrual equity consists of a variety of intersecting factors, which we will be learning a lot about today and discussing many related concepts. At the end of today's workshop, we hope that you will understand A, what period poverty is, and the variety of impacts it has in Canada. Number two, or I guess B, to follow suit, we will be discussing the role that education has in transforming the stigma and shame often associated with menstruation and menstrual health. And C, by the end of today's session, we hope you'll have a clear idea of what period poverty and menstrual stigma are, what the differences between them are, and how they interact and impact folks differently. And D, we want you to walk away from this workshop with a boost in confidence in your ability to talk about menstrual equity and menstrual health. Today, we will be talking about menstrual equity and period poverty. And to make sure we're all on the same page about what these terms mean, we're going to start super basic with some definitions. Not everyone will be familiar with these terms, which is completely fine. A globally recognized definition of menstrual health did not exist until 2021, which is pretty wild if you think about it, which is only 3 years ago. So 51 stakeholders came together to define menstrual health, and the definition is grounded in the World Health Organization's definition of health and well-being. So menstrual health is defined as a state of a complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity in relation to the menstrual cycle. Unfortunately, in Canada, this definition of menstrual health, where complete physical, mental, and social well-being in relation to the menstrual cycle, does not match the reality of many people who menstruate here in Canada. This is where period poverty and period stigma come in. Period poverty is the lack or absence of adequate menstruation supplies or menstrual products, and education arising from financial hardships. Our immediate thoughts may go to pads and tampons and other products, but in reality, this can also refer to period pain supplies like Tylenol, heat packs, and reliable transportation. Period stigma, on the other hand, refers to the negative perception of menstruation, and these things will come to reinforce each other like a cycle, kind of how you can see on the slide here, where the lack of education to menstrual health education or menstrual supplies can lead to the perpetuation of false ideologies and influence the experiences of menstruators. So, what do we mean by this? We're going to look at an example and do a little bit of a story time about this one student named Alex. So Alex gets their period in class and doesn't have a pad or a tampon. So they ask their teacher if they have one. The teacher looks around in their purse and reluctantly pulls one out and whispers, "You know, Alex, you should make sure you always have one. This isn't something you should put in your home." This leads to Alex feeling embarrassed, belittled, ashamed, and the next time Alex probably won't ever ask for a tampon again. And the next time they may need one out of fear of being shamed or alienated for having a period, they decide to wear the same one for longer than they should. And they ration their tampons because they only have 3 to 4 good ones for the entire month due to financial barriers. And since they've been too nervous to speak openly about periods based on their previous experiences, Alex is not aware of the potential risks that come with wearing the same tampon for longer than the recommended time and is too afraid to access the free period products provided by the school. This one encounter with the teacher leaves Alex with an understanding that periods are not something you talk about, no matter the situation. Because of this, they avoid going out, participating in extracurriculars, and even missing school when they're on their period because they do not have access to the necessary supplies and are too afraid to ask for help. Alex is a fictional character, but their story is the reality of many people in Canada. In Canada, 68% of people who menstruate have missed out on participating in school or social activities because of their periods, and 86% have gotten their periods without immediate access to menstrual supplies. Something we think is important to mention is oftentimes these statistics and studies will tend to ignore or exclude trans menstruators. And by trans menstruators, we mean anyone who is not a cis menstruator from any of this research. So it is essential that we acknowledge that because these statistics were likely not complete to begin with, the studies are likely not as solid as they could be either. This considered, because not all menstruators were included for these studies or statistics, these numbers would be significantly higher. And there is still a lot more research to be done to determine how all menstruators, including trans folks, are impacted by menstrual inequity. The main takeaway from this example is that we cannot say we have menstrual equity in Canada right now. To achieve menstrual equity would appropriate information and education, access to period-related care, and to be able to experience a stigma-free environment and freedom to participate in all activities how we as menstruators choose to. But why do we see this? Why does menstrual stigma exist, and why do people struggle to access these products? Now, let's go back to our example with Alex. Imagine if Alex had encountered another teacher, friend, sibling, acquaintance, etc., who had supported them in learning about menstruation and had provided them with tips and suggestions instead of shaming them for having asked or for having needed a necessity. Alex's views on menstruation would likely be very different. Research study conducted by Us tried to understand this. Why does menstrual inequity exist? We followed the patterns and underlying structure and realized that menstrual inequity exists partially because of how we view, understand, and talk about it. And the only way we can really make change in this kind of area is through education. I hope that as you kind of take in this information, you will consider teaching about menstruation or talking openly about menstruation in your work if there is an opportunity to do so. With that, I'll hand over our baton to Kuisan.
Thank you, Priya. We have identified the importance of education in combating menstrual inequity, but how do we actually practice this and how do we talk about menstrual health? So, just like the four phases of the menstrual cycle, which we will touch on a little bit later, we've kind of made a four-step guide to making menstrual health education more accessible, inclusive, and fun. So, the four things that we want to talk about in the next couple of minutes are language, intersectionality, changing the narrative, and management of the menstrual cycle. So, when we think about periods, I'm sure that we've all kind of heard many times before different puns. So, for example, like on the rag or Shark Week, maybe Aunt Flo. But we really do encourage you to call a period what it is, which is a period. A big part of smashing period stigma is really encouraging people to call menstruation what it is. When we use terms like being on the rag or the curse, it does bring up a lot of kind of negative connotations associated with periods. Another example that we like to highlight in relation to language is the term menstrual hygiene or hygiene products. When I hear hygiene or I think of hygiene, I think of cleaning something that's like really, really dirty. So when we kind of tag a word like that onto menstruation or call menstrual supplies like hygiene products or sanitary products, we're kind of again reinforcing these negative connotations that periods are something that are like dirty, that we need to get rid of, that we need to clean. Um, you may also notice that in our presentation and just on our slides that we use the term menstruators instead of girls or women when we're talking about periods. And that's because some trans, non-binary, two-spirit, and intersex folks menstruate as well. So just having a period doesn't make someone a woman. And similarly, not having a period doesn't make someone any less of a woman. Many people who have a uterus may also stop menstruating due to health conditions or stress or medications, etc. This constant association of womanhood and or femininity with menstruation can lead to feelings of dysphoria for lots of trans folks. While some trans men menstruate, it's important that we remember that menstruators exist in different identities, genders, and sizes, etc. We should really keep an open mind when it comes to who may menstruate. And when you use language that is gender neutral to discuss menstruation, it can help gender nonconforming and transgender individuals feel safer and more comfortable. It's a very simple but impactful step that we can take towards making sure that everyone's menstrual experiences are comfortable. But how do we do this in practice? It's easy enough to, say it, but we do really need to practice using this language in our day-to-day lives. So some examples we like to show, like on this chart. For example, instead of saying feminine hygiene products, we can say menstrual supplies or period supplies. Instead of women's health, we can say menstrual or reproductive health. Instead of women and girls, like we spoke about, we can say people who menstruate or people with periods. Um, Again, if we're consistently associating periods to womanhood, it makes it much harder for trans people to have access to essential care and essential education about their own health. So this importance that we're, kind of emphasizing about language really ties into a concept called intersectionality, which was a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. The effects of period poverty are multifaceted and they're compounding. They disproportionately impact certain populations, namely marginalized groups, based on the intersecting of particular social identities. For example, 34% of all Canadians have to regularly sacrifice something within their budget to afford menstrual products. Like Priya spoke about before, this stat is actually likely much higher and is not properly reflected due to the exclusion of trans, gender diverse, and intersex individuals from such research and statistics. Another thing to note is that in Canada, racialized people and 2S LGBTQIA plus people are more likely to experience economic poverty, and that really compounds with period poverty. So to put this in terms or kind of a visual that's easier to digest, If you're looking at the image on the right of the screen, which represents the social determinants of health, you can see how some of these factors that may contribute to someone's experience with period poverty, how they interact and overlap. So now that we have an understanding of what period poverty is, I'm going to pass it back to Priya, and they're going to do a really fun budgeting activity.
So we are going to do some budgeting and we are going to look at Mrs. Martinez's situation. So Mrs. Martinez is a seventh grade middle school teacher in Sudbury, Ontario. She lives with her partner and has two children who are 7 and 11 respectively. They are currently budgeting their finances so that their family can live comfortably. Here we're gonna imagine that Mrs. Martinez owns this super simple form of money in her society, which is coin. So she has 15 coins that she can spend each month. Of course, it's significantly more complicated like this in real life, but for now, we're going to do some budgeting with some simple numbers that don't require a calculator. So, step one, now that we know Mrs. Martinez a little bit, we're going to help her make some decisions. She is trying to budget for three main categories: food, housing, and transportation, as you all can see on the screen. There are three choices for each within each category. These choices have a number on the right of them, which is how much this choice costs.
Hi, okay there. So sorry, you want us to say where we would take the money, where we would budget?
Yep. So you will take Mrs. Martinez's
Yeah,
15 coins and then allocate them across three categories.
makes sense, but every situation's different, right? I mean, I feel very privileged that I work in a school, so I can make sure that there are an abundance of supplies for high schoolers, which I mean, I feel like the richest person ever, right? But I mean, once you frame it like this, and I think, oh my gosh, their mothers or don't aren't as fortunate, you know. I this it's a great discussion, um, and this example is a great way to for us to look at it and say, oh wow, like our families struggle, and the fact that they've even got to look at allocation like this,
Thanks for
right? And I
sharing,
think
Tiff.
that's
Honestly,
the hard
yeah,
part of this. There is no right answer.
definitely. It's one of the reasons why this activity is kind of structured like this,
Mhm.
is to kind of force these decisions and kind of see kind of the background that comes behind it. Um, so yeah, I appreciate your reflection on privilege though. I think it's one of the other important things and feelings that we wanted to evoke with this exercise, um, was really to show kind of that sometimes we really forget about this stuff and there's so many other people that have to deal with this all the time.
Yeah, and I mean, there's part of me that hopes that when families do have kids, they know that they're going to either be fed or be allowed these supplies. You know, I think that's why I work with a lot of newcomers, and they just breathe a sigh of relief that, you know what, we in our education system, most of us are pretty fortunate to be able to, you know, at least look after the kids, right? But yeah, it's a great conversation that I think is important to open up to everyone, right?
When I look at this activity, it's hard not to kind of think of it from my personal perspective and my personal location, which is like a big part of the activity as well, is just recognizing like kind of what you said, like privilege. I went kind of fives across the board, and these are some decisions that like I don't want to make and that are really difficult to make. And so yeah, for me, and like again, I don't live in Sudbury, so it was really hard for me to kind of like wrap my head around it. But for me, I live in Vancouver. It's really, really transportation accessible. Um, so I was fine kind of like for all family members to take public transport and then 2 hours to commute and then have home cooked meals for each family member is what I chose. Um, I'm curious if anyone chose any different combinations. Okay. And now that we've done that, we are basically going to complicate things a little bit more. So moving on to kind of like the next part of the activity here, we are now faced with a challenge of Mrs. Martinez's child who got their period. Mrs. Martinez now has to purchase period supplies for them, and that is going to be 1 coin per month. So now essentially your budget is working with 14 coins, and I'm curious how you would reallocate those coins. I did six, or sorry, I did 3, 6, 6. That's math, right? Yeah. So I chose the food bank, and then 2 children will share a room, but a shorter commute to work. And then all family members, no, wait, that's not math. I have 14 coins. Okay, I did 3 for food then, um, 6 for housing, and 5 for transportation. So 2 children will share a room, but a shorter commute to work, but all family members have to take public transport. That's what I did.
There's so many other barriers. I have such a hard time with this activity, right? Like, because like you were saying, it depends. Do they live in a big city, a small city? Um, there's so many other variables to consider, right?
Yes, 100%. And this activity is really,
Yeah.
meant to like be uncomfortable and just be like, ugh, I don't want to make any of these decisions. Kind of like highlighting that reality for people who like are, for lack of a better word, just like forced to make these decisions uh,
Mhm.
due to like the circumstances and how kind of like society is structured and such. Yeah, it's like a frustrating activity.
It is, and I'm trying to be positive, be like, "Oh, this is all right," but I'm like, "No, this is not good," which I know is your point, but yeah,
It definitely like sparks discussion. Um, and you know, the other, there's so many different things like you were saying. Another scenario that we have, which we won't actually kind of get into, is that instead of like the child getting their period or maybe at the same time, Mrs. Martinez is diagnosed with endometriosis, and that is a debilitating chronic pain condition. And so as a result, Mrs. Martinez has to work part-time, and that takes away some resources as well. So even though we won't necessarily go through this exercise again with that scenario, it's just one kind of other way to look at how period poverty affects different people and how drastically this does affect families and individuals.
oh yeah.
So
And I was also thinking, you said, "Oh, just have the two share a room." Well, what if the boy and a girl, and the girl doesn't want to stay with her brother or whatever, right? So,
totally, totally. There's so many different factors, so many
mhm.
different scenarios that play into the decision making, and sometimes those decisions are like not the ones that someone wants to make. Um, so yeah, like the scenarios that we're exploring here, menstruation has an impact on the Martinez family clearly, and that's not only physically, so like for example, it's not only just the endometriosis symptoms or cramps or anything like that, but it's also emotionally and financially, and having to, make those certain sacrifices in certain areas to afford simply having a period or having a chronic condition. So being able to understand and appreciate those decisions that Mrs. Martinez is making for her family is really key in understanding how various socioeconomic factors, social identities, and also demographic factors influence those day-to-day decisions made by menstruators in order to make ends meet. So jumping back into things here, we're just going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about how we make conversations around menstruation more relatable, especially if we are talking to and working with youth. One of the things that I personally like to do when I'm working with youth and talking about menstruation is using personal stories and experiences. The idea here is really to normalize the experience and change the narrative. Um, as you've seen in the presentation, we use numbers and quotes, which are really great on an advocacy level. But if you're speaking with younger folks, you really want to be able to like have that piece of connection. Um, and you'll be able to connect more through that kind of storytelling component. If you're comfortable, it's great to speak really openly and honestly about your own experiences, while at the same time validating those who do have different experiences, because menstruation is a very diverse and unique experience from person to person. Menstrual symptoms are also something that is unique for each person. So, when we talk about menstrual health and management, a lot of focus is generally placed on the bleeding aspect of menstruation. For example, when we talk about like missing activities, missing classes, a lot of attention is really placed on not having access to pads and tampons, which is very true in a lot of cases. But people might also be missing activities because they're experiencing cramps or other symptoms that are related to menstruation. So, for this reason, it's really essential to look at the entire menstrual cycle and to consider all the different phases, and that one might have different needs or wants in relation to products or care, depending on where they are in their monthly cycle. So, just as each individual experiences symptoms differently, these symptoms can look even different just in one person, depending on the phase of their cycle. So, a myth that you may have heard about periods is that each phase of the cycle lasts 1 week. So, not only is this not true for everyone, but some of the phases actually overlap. Generally, people associate symptoms like cramps with the menstruation phase, but many people also experience cramps, sometimes even more extremely during the ovulation phase. That is something that I so rudely found out recently because I get very bad cramps during my ovulation phase now. And again, yeah, that can change throughout your life, so that's fun. Um, so, understanding the four phases of the menstrual cycle can really help us to make decisions about how we manage our menstrual health. For example, knowing that the follicular phase is generally associated with higher energy levels and the menstruation phase is generally associated with lower energy levels, we can really take this information and help ourselves kind of plan our schedules and self-care routines a little bit more in depth based on that. And for some folks, knowing the phases of the menstrual cycle is really, really essential in managing menstrual conditions, which manifest as more than just premenstrual syndrome symptoms, so PMS symptoms. And while discomfort associated with your period is common, extreme or debilitating pain is not normal. Some examples of menstrual conditions, and there's many out there, but these are just some examples. Endometriosis, which we kind of talked about a little bit in our budgeting activity. This is a disease in which endometrial-like tissue grows outside of your uterus, and it's associated with quite a bit of pain and chronic condition. PMDD or premenstrual dysphoric disorder is essentially very, very severe PMS symptoms, such as severe depression and mood changes. And dysmenorrhea is severe or debilitating cramping that essentially, like, you can't do your daily activities because of the pain. Like I said before, there's many different kind of conditions that impact people who have a period. So, understanding the symptoms and the phases and the conditions associated with periods can help us choose the period products that work best for ourselves. This table here shows just some different considerations that you might make when you're deciding between the different types of products available or which ones you want to use. So, an example that we really like to highlight is that we kind of know that reusables are a great option. They're environmentally friendly and generally just create less waste. But if you don't have access to consistent wash facilities, it's really not an option for someone. So we really need to be mindful of the different choices available and how these choices are chosen based on certain circumstances. The most empowering thing that you can do is to provide all the options available for the management of menstruation itself, as well as the management of other physical and emotional manifestations of the menstrual cycle. So, kind of like we talked about, the emotional aspect and other aspects as well. We are now going to apply some of the knowledge that we learned today to real life scenarios. And we would love, like, we really want to make this workshop work for you. So we would love if anyone had a scenario that they wanted to share with us that you've kind of encountered in your work in relation to menstruation. We can use some of the information that we learned today to kind of like talk about that scenario. So, does anyone off the top of their head have one? I will preface that we have a scenario prepared just in case, but I thought I would offer if someone has a scenario that they'd like to explore together.
I work in an elementary school, or like a few of them, and we have period products available in washrooms for free, sort of thing. However, we had students like removing them and playing with them at the elementary school, which is great because then you get to try it out and that. But the staff that work there were having a hard time because we don't have unlimited supply of because we have a budget as well, I guess. So the tricky bit was then what do they do and where do we put them so they're still accessible, but not being played with by some of the students who don't actually are not using them for the function, and like how do we provide that was like a period adjacent, but it was for availability with them. And we didn't have a solution, really. We kept coming up with other options, but there was not really a solution there.
Yes. And I think like part of like this curiosity about period products is like a very beautiful thing. Kids are just really curious and playing with the products and like learning about them is like almost just like there's a curiosity there, but I totally get the worry around like the financial part of it and like how do we keep these products stocked and like make sure that they're being used for people who need them. And I think like having that conversation with students and just being like, oh my gosh, it's really great that you're like curious about this. Can we like, if you're interested in learning more, we can have that conversation. And then kind of explain like some people are going to need to use this. So like we can, I know that some like sex educators come into classrooms and they have like a pad that they just kind of use as a display. So possibly like creating some kind of like thing like that if kids are curious about learning. And having that as kind of the one that they go to check out all the folds and check out how like they can fold the diva cup and or a menstrual cup and all that kind of stuff. Could be like a fun solution. And just having that like really open conversation about like it's great that you're curious. And if you have any questions, kind of like ask those. That's kind of like an approach that I might take. I've worked in elementary schools as well, and you got lots of curious kids there. So
Totally. And that just even while you're talking to even having like playable ones beside the machine that delivers it is like curious, ask Brianna, your school counselor. She's if you want to know more. Yeah. Just trying to get into every classroom, and with some families' discomfort around this topic can be a barrier a lot of the time, even when it's in the curriculum about this. It can still be a barrier, and families are uncomfortable, which is too bad. But yeah, I think that's a great idea. for
Yeah, I completely agree with Kwisa, I and Brianna definitely love this scenario. I think it's a really important one, and funny enough, it's one that was sort of brought up at another workshop that we've had this week. Is kind of this ask of kind of how do you navigate this curiosity while not kind of imposing any stigma or other limiting beliefs on the children while they're kind of open to the idea. Um, so yeah, really my thoughts too were kind of like to create like a sort of maquette type of thing. I was thinking more cardboard. I don't know why I didn't think of just taking one pad and just using that. Um, but to honestly, yeah, to really play into that curiosity and to, I don't want to say the sense of capitalism, but like to kind of use the opportunity to, it can be a teachable moment. Because I know it gets a little bit more complicated as kind of kids get older, and none of this was kind of squashed when they were younger, and then they get to high school, and then now you have kind of these boys who know maybe nothing about it, or even like girls, um, who are now laughing at a pad. So again, like I completely agree with what Kusan said, having like a little like show display pad. Um, and definitely kind of taking it as like an education moment, especially because they're at school. I mean, all the more to learn there. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
Amazing. I love chit-chatting and I love the curiosity of kids. That like actually makes me really happy. Thank you so much, Brianna, for sharing the scenario. We are going to move forward. So that kind of scenario exercise we just went through, just like demonstrates the importance of talking openly about menstruation with youth. So kind of like we suggested, there is inherently a curiosity about things. So encouraging that and having those open discussions, even when it can be like silly or awkward, is really, really important. And not even just with youth, but I think Brianna, like you said, like some of the staff at your school were having, issues with how do we handle this. So even having those conversations with our peers and our colleagues is super important as well. And as you kind of plan to do these things, we also really want to encourage inviting non-menstruators into these conversations. So, in my experience in the menstrual advocacy space, one of the reasons that menstrual inaccessibility and inequity issues have kind of persisted and been around for so long is that a lot of the people with the ability to make big decisions are people who don't necessarily have to think about periods, kind of like we saw in the iceberg model. Lots of the people who are in positions of power to make decisions are non-menstruators. So in their world, having a period is just not necessarily a challenge to begin with. And this is kind of why the issue was never solved. So the majority of the time, when we do have a chance to kind of sit down with non-menstruators and have an open discussion, they are compassionate in their understanding. But with that said, before speaking to them, they often just have a lot of assumptions. And something that comes up a lot is that they feel like it's not either their problem or their place to do anything, when in reality, they probably have a loved one facing these challenges. And even if they don't, people just face these challenges. So let's figure it out. So what we really highly encourage is for non-menstruators to join these conversations. And within our individual practices, your individual practices, we really encourage people to make conversations accessible to non-menstruators as well. Our society's kind of set up where it's like, ooh, we don't talk about this, but if we invite non-menstruators to talk about it, then we're kind of quashing that stigma. So one way we can do this is simply by inquiring. So depending on the context, if you're talking about menstruation with your family, for example, you can invite the non-menstruating members to attend that discussion, that kitchen table discussion. If it's a school setting, you can make the same request. If you have a website, you can kind of clearly highlight that the education you offer is available to non-menstruators. We really just want to encourage people to be involved and not just see periods as a menstruator issue. And so we have identified that bringing in non-menstruators to conversations about menstruation is essential in our efforts to achieve menstrual equity. And we just wanted to share some other actionable items that you can kind of share with your youth, practice with yourselves. Yeah, we do encourage these calls to actions to be used kind of like in your own lives with youth and your colleagues and outside of work as well. So, for example, for youth, we can encourage getting them involved with different like volunteer opportunities, getting them comfortable using menstruation related terms. So, again, like calling a period a period. I am actually totally guilty of like when I play co-ed soccer. I'm on the field, I'm like on my period and I'm running around and I'm like, oh, it's my time of month. I'm like, why am I saying this like this? Like, why am I not just saying I have my period? So even I'm still practicing that like in my life and it's my job. So we just really encourage people to continuously practice and model this behavior and especially with youth, kind of like encourage them to speak openly about menstruation, both around their menstruating and non-menstruating peers. Again, connecting them with organizations that do menstrual equity work, and just providing them with the confidence and the tools to encourage both their peers and, adults in their lives to engage in menstrual equity efforts. And again, just same kind of for people who are working with youth, organizing accessible period products in your workplace, like Brianna was talking about, hosting a menstruation discussion or education workshop with staff at the school or with some of your colleagues, and just always continue practicing having those conversations because I think that the more we talk openly about periods, the more it will become less of like a thing. So these little efforts that may seem kind of insignificant are sometimes what actually create the biggest change, and the most long-lasting change as well. So we really are at the end of the presentation now. And the last thing that we wanted to do before we leave today is to invite you to Charms, which you can access through the QR code again on your screen. This is kind of where you're going to find free courses, free resources, as well as a network of individuals involved in menstrual equity work. Super fun, little Facebook moment, but like, period. And we also will be sending out a follow-up email with all this information. So don't worry about like, missing it. But yeah, it's great. There's like some little courses you can take and they're all free. And then people post about different resources and events happening. So yeah, highly recommend checking out Charms. And before we leave today, just wanted to know if there were any last questions or any comments before we head out.
Hi, so I am a licensed financial professional and I kind of target market is that younger demographic and sometimes parents who are dealing with teens who are now getting their period. And aside from like budget optimization, do you know any other strategies that I can do to alleviate the burden from kind of choosing between menstrual products or like household expenses?
That is a great question. I think that's a really like broad scale question, kind of on like a really like societal level of how things are like kind of structured. So the reality right now being that people have to choose between menstrual care and like different other necessities. Um, One thing I would maybe, if you are like providing some information, is to kind of do a scan of the area that you work in, and kind of note down different places that might have access to like free supplies. Um, that could be a good option to provide to people. And you can kind of do like a quick Google search of like, I know, at least in Vancouver, at UBC, there's a Free Periods Canada made a map of like different locations that offer free menstrual supplies. So looking into things like that could be a really good option to provide to people if they are looking for things that are going to like reduce costs. That would be kind of my lower level I guess suggestion, and then otherwise just kind of engaging in advocacy work for advocating for free period supplies and such.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Priya, I don't know if you wanted to add something. Okay, cool.
No, that was great. Honestly, pretty much same answer. I was gonna suggest to reach out to any local organizations within, I say the BC region as someone not from BC, but to kind of see, I guess, yeah, who's kind of doing what kind of work are they leaning on? For example, like with the Ontario organizations. So I know that like there's often drives that are done and stuff like that to go out to people experiencing period poverty. Um, but I'm not one to speak on what is going on in the BC, and that is why Kuisan is here.
Yes. Thank you for that question. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. If you want to share this workshop with other folks, please do. We are hosting quite a few just public facing ones as well in the next little while. But yeah, thank you so much. And we hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their week and a great weekend.